following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
I personally think that the graph is very important for Web3 because it really improves both the developer experience and user experience significantly. And this is really important for adoption, right?
Galactic astronauts floating in the space of time, lost between the past and the future.
That is the sound of inevitable.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Vincent Chee, a Web3 Full Stack Engineer working at Superfluid. Vincent and I first met after he presented during a community talk session, and I immediately wanted to meet him to learn more about Superfluid and how he and the team uses the graph. Superfluid is revolutionizing how payments and crypto can work, and as you'll hear from Vincent, the ways in which we think about money. During this interview, Vincent talks about university, where he studied computer science, his move to Web3, going to work on smart contracts, how he got started in Web3, and then how he ended up working at Superfluid. Then, Vincent and I talk about the graph and the ways in which it's an important tool for devs building in Web3 and how Superfluid uses it. We started the discussion talking about Vincent's educational background.
So I was educated in Beijing for most of my life at an international school, and I went to college in upstate New York to study computer science.
When you talk about studying computer science, did you ever talk about blockchain or crypto when you were studying computer science?
I actually never really encountered it directly. I do remember Bitcoin was discussed a bit during 2017 in my senior year, but nothing about smart contracts, surprisingly. And I honestly wish I had actually written my thesis on this. That would have been a great head start, but didn't do that, unfortunately.
In 2017, when it was brought up your senior year, do you remember the context it was brought up? And I asked these questions, by the way, to get a sense of what the universities are teaching on the subject for people that are studying something so domain specific, and keep interviewing people and asking, did you study this in college or did you come across it, to get a sense of what's being taught? So what was being said in 2017 where you were?
Yeah, it wasn't that much about the tech, honestly. It was more people, just students actually, like, oh, look at the price, so nothing really about the actual technology and decentralization and all of that. Just a usual buzz and hype.
Was anything said about distributed systems? And I know that, again, that's a little bit specific to the crypto industry, but I've had other individuals who've studied computer science did discuss distributed systems on occasion.
I think there were some courses about distributed systems, but I didn't take those. And pretty sure no one discussed smart contracts, not explicitly at least.
Vincent, as you mentioned there, you are from China. And I always like to ask my guests from different parts of the world if they have a sense of what the crypto scene is like where they're from. And in the case of China, I'd be curious to know, do you have a sense of what the crypto scene is or what the opinions and attitudes there are for it?
I'm actually a Malaysian Chinese. Like I said earlier, I grew up in Beijing, and I've only lived in Malaysia briefly for actually just 1 year. Unfortunately, I don't have a really strong finger on the pulse of the communities in either country, but I have a feeling that the communities in both countries are fairly vibrant. And I know that two Malaysian crypto companies, CoinGecko and Etherscan, and there's plenty of Chinese projects.
Well, Vincent, you are joining me from Estonia. I'm curious to know what took you to Estonia.
Yep. So I actually moved to Estonia to work for Superfluid. Funnily enough, I actually didn't know much about Estonia prior to moving there, but the idea of working in a crypto company, especially one as exciting as Superfluid, and moving to an unknown land seemed like an adventure that I'd be interested in taking. So I took it. I thought this was kind of like the path less taken, so I decided to go for it, and I did.
And what can you share about the crypto scene in Estonia? Have you got a sense for that yet?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that it's pretty solid, especially given the size of the country. There's 1.3 million people, so it's not huge. And about 400,000 people living in Tallinn, the city I'm living in. I haven't gone to many meetups, but I am in a Telegram group with Web3 builders. So there's definitely a presence here. The first ever ETH Talon is actually happening this year. And there was NFT Talon last year, I think for a few years already. And we also have some guys from Stakewise. They're doing some pretty cool ETH liquid staking stuff. And they work in the same office with us. There's actually even a crypto community called WEN forming at the very edge of Estonia in Narva, an Estonian city bordering Russia. So there's quite a few crypto communities within Estonia.
For listeners who might find themselves traveling to or through Estonia someday, what's your advice to them? What's something they've got to see or something they've got to try while they're there?
Well, yeah, I would say like if you've never visited an old town of a European city, just to visit the old town. It's going to sound kind of silly, but when I went there the first time, I feel like going through time, going back in time. It's a very cool architecture. And if you have been to an old town before and you've been to a few in Europe, it's probably going to be pretty boring. Then going to like a sauna or having a walk through nature is probably the next best thing.
Well, Vincent, you and I are talking today because of your work at Superfluid and some of the great experiences you've had in using the graph. You presented during community talk, and I immediately reached out and thought, I'd like to learn more about you and the things you're working on. To set the stage for the work you're doing at Superfluid, it'd be fun to go back in time and talk a little bit about when you first became aware of crypto and what your initial thoughts or impressions were.
Yeah, so I actually first heard about crypto and more specifically Bitcoin in like 2012 or so. And I watched a video about a bunch of people spending a bunch of money building Bitcoin farms. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. People are actually doing this. And then I dug in a bit more and learned about what Bitcoin was and what it was trying to do. And I thought that the idea of a decentralized internet native money, which no centralized party at least really had full control over and which you could really own and be custodian of, was really exciting to me. And I could definitely see the vision and feel like this was going to be something in the future. But I was in high school, so.
Okay, Vincent, so you become aware of Bitcoin in 2012, but you're still a little young and not probably certain how to get into the space. What was the journey you took after getting your degree in computer science to working full-time in Web3?
It actually took quite a while from when I first heard of Bitcoin. I think my interest was rekindled in 2017 when all the hype was of us, like most people. Don't really hear about this until it gets into the news and stuff. I started my full-time job, so I didn't really look into it. Didn't really look into the code. I mainly just read white papers and just tried to understand what people were trying to do at the time, and learned about Ethereum more, especially, and thought that was interesting. I continued to keep a fairly light pulse on crypto for the next 2 years. Didn't dig in as much as I wish I had because I was fairly busy during my job, just life in general. Then I partook a bit in DeFi summer and kind of forgot about it all again when COVID hit and a bunch more of life happened. And finally, when I moved back to Malaysia and I was figuring out what to do again, I hopped back into crypto once again. And when I was figuring out what to do, I was considering like possible life paths. I could work towards becoming a dev for a large Web2 company, just Google or one of those things, or at least try to, and kind of have a set in stone and path that's fairly known. You can kind of see many other people who have taken that path already. And that wasn't very exciting and kind of dreaded that idea. The other option was to work in Web3 or completing edge tech and being part of this crypto movement. And so the decision was fairly clear there. So I started to learn smart contract development when I really made this decision. I was like, okay, I'm going to give myself basically a few months to try and get a job in crypto. And if I don't, I'll just do the Web2 thing. Basically, my dad was like, yo, you got to get a job. And I was like, okay, fine. Give me a few months. Let me go ham at this. And if I can do it, I'm going to do it. And if I can't, then I'll do what you say. So I basically started learning smart contract development, started with the very basics, did crypto zombies, and I joined a Discord for learning Solidity development run by someone called 0x Gabby, and did some challenges in a hack MD from someone called Capo Joseph. I did these challenges, and I also did some other challenges just to get the feel of Solidity, and I was able to actually get a pretty decent paying freelancing gig early on with Capo Joseph. He literally tweeted out for people to complete the challenges in the document. And if you could, just reach out to him and he'll find a gig. And I was apparently like the only one who actually reached out and did. So like for people who want to get into the space, when someone says stuff like that, you just have to like reach out and ask. The worst thing that happens is they just ignore you and nothing happens. That's it. Eventually, through some suggestions from people in Discord, I decided to join a hackathon because I wanted to keep like growing my skills and be able to get a job eventually. So in one of the crypto communities I was in, there was a group of people who were also interested in learning smart contract development. And I met someone who wanted to hack using Superfluid as the main project to build on top of. So I joined ETH Global, I think back in 2020 or 2021, one of those years. And one of the co-founders of Superfluid reached out on Discord and asked me to apply for a position. I'm sure he was asking all of the people there. And the position was senior smart contract developer. And I didn't meet any of the requirements. Obviously, it was like 2+ years of solidity, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to go for it. And I thought, the worst case scenario is nothing would change. And I would just continue with my journey and eventually get into the industry. And maybe just a bit later, like that's fine. So this went into an interview with Mike, our COO, just to get a feel at first. Then a technical one with Meow, our CTO. And I think it was 2. I kind of just went over my hackathon project and added some other stuff after. And the final interview was Fran, the CEO, to see if I was a culture fit. And when I got the offer, it was definitely like the highlight of that year. So I was very happy.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTIQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
Your journey into Web3 is unique in some ways, but it's also emblematic of so many others' journey. And what always interests me about it is how self-starter oriented the journey is. These are things you're doing on your own volition. These are things you hope to get paid for. These are things that you hope to end up getting work to do. What is the conviction during this period of your life to keep doing something that has, risk? It may not turn out for you.
Yeah, I think I am a risk-seeking individual. I think it's also a risk not to take risks sometimes. So first, I guess there's that fundamentally. In terms of Web3, I think my conviction comes from a lot of the Web3 ideals. We might not be able to reach some of the most extreme versions of this, extreme decentralization, just completely detached from government and stuff. But I think moving towards the direction of the Web3 ideals and pushing resistance back from the status quo is going to be great. And yeah, I think I might be wrong, but at least I took a big risk. I met some smart people and I learned a bunch along the way and I had a bunch of fun. So
most of my listeners will be familiar, at least at concept, of what a smart contract is, but they might not understand what a smart contract developer does. Can you just describe at a very high level what it means for someone to say, I'm a smart contract developer?
So I would say that a smart contract developer often involves having to scope out a solution to a specific problem. And it has to be something which makes sense to solve on the blockchain. You don't always want to just throw everything on the blockchain because it might not make sense to do that, but it's something that makes sense to be put on the blockchain. And there's a lot of things to take into consideration. On the one hand, you have to make sure your smart contract is secure. It's optimized for gas because people are spending money to interact with it. You have to test it. This comes into the first and second point I was mentioning. And it should be auditable. This helps all the things above. And a bunch of other minutiae related to the programming language, the blockchain, and a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to get into here. And on the other hand, you also have to consider how the client side will be able to interact with the smart contract.
As I said, your story is one about self-directed ambition to kind of learn these things on your own. If a listener wants to learn these things themselves, if they have an interest in better understanding smart contracts or how to write or maybe even audit a smart contract, what advice do you have for them? What resources or things did you find that were super helpful?
You have to really want it. And if you really do, you need to really believe that you can achieve it no matter what. And when you want it really badly, then you just have to work really hard at it and take it one day at a time. Prove yourself to the point where you can deliver something for someone else or yourself, for that matter. For example, you might want to get a job at a specific company or just in the space in general. And you just need to figure out what that entails and be able to do that and show people that you can do that. Because like you said, there's just so many people in this space who had some sort of goal, or vision, and they just went for it and are now at least on the road closer to where they really want to be. I also think it's pretty important to expose yourself to as many different parts of the stack as possible. And once you've found an area or problem that you're more interested in, just to really hone in and focus on that specifically.
Vincent, this is sort of a tough question. I definitely want to ask it to you, and I've asked it to other guests of the podcast. And it's this idea about the utility or the ways in which the world is better. You're a younger professional. You mentioned that Web 2 never really interested you. You were always going to pursue something in Web 3. So my question is, why is the world better off when young professionals, young developers like yourself pursue building in Web 3 versus accepting the jobs that exist in Web 2?
I do think that people in Web 2 are doing important stuff. It's just not my cup of tea always. And I think that in terms of devs working in Web 3, I think we're working on really hard unsolved problems. And the fact that Web 3 unlocks many new possibilities in changing the way we interact on the internet with information and value. In terms of information, the ability to have the choice of control over your own data. So this includes content that you create and maybe even monetize. And also financial transparency is improved. And that maybe not everyone can read the smart contracts, but at least it's all there. And some people can read that. In terms of value, the ability to transfer money in an uncensorable way and being able to create experiments with something like Superfluid and even changing the way we interact with money fundamentally.
When you think about the future, does Web3 coexist with Web 2? This is another common question I ask of guests on the podcast, and some listeners are probably getting sick of hearing it, but there is debate about this, and it is an important question to resolve to better understand and navigate the future of this emerging industry in Web3. And so what do you think? Does Web3 coexist with Web 2, or is this a zero-sum game where one of them is going to win out in the end?
I think that Web3 will coexist with Web 2. I don't think it's zero-sum at all. I think while the Web3 has some important properties, censorship resistance, ownership of data, transparency, the Web3 stack just doesn't make sense for all applications, as there's going to be trade-offs when using the Web3 stack or any sort of technology for that matter. You don't want to use the same tool for every job, right?
I'd be curious to know what you tell your friends and family, what you're working on, and how you describe to them the work you're doing in Web3. What do you say?
Well, when I usually tell them I'm working in crypto, they usually lose interest pretty fast, especially right now in the bear market. But if they are interested in it, I will go into what I do at Superfluid, which is writing smart contracts, working on the subgraph, and working on the SDK. And depending on their technical level, I'll go into more or less depth each of those sections, depending on their interests as well.
Do you ever take the time to explain to them why it's important, why Web3 is something that you have conviction for?
Yeah, for sure. I explained to them some of the ideals of Web3, at least in my opinion, and they either don't get it or they do. It doesn't seem to be middle ground normally with this type of thing. It's quite polarizing.
What do you think the biggest misconception about Web3 or crypto is? You've said that sometimes people don't get it when you explain it to them, or sometimes they lose interest immediately when you say, I'm working in crypto. What's the most common misconception you're coming up against?
I think that they just think we're scamming people. We just sell JPEGs, meme coins, and that there's no real innovation occurring or real and valuable tech being produced. But I think that most people don't really understand what the value proposition of crypto, as they've always had access to decent financial tools. At least most people I talk to, they've got banking, stable currency. They're not having a hard time opening a bank account or holding onto a currency which is like inflating 1,000% a year or something like that. So it's really hard to explain the value proposition to those types of people because it's the financial system might be working for them or whatever.
Vincent, it's incredible to think that your role at Superfluid came as a result of work you were doing at hackathons and just reaching out and building a network. What do you think it says about our industry that so many individuals like yourself eventually find full-time roles because of their work at hackathons? And I'm even thinking about former guests, people like the founders at 1inch. I've had Sergey on, or the founders at Request Network. I had Christoph on, and the list goes on and on. In your case, how important do you think these hackathons are for people like you trying to get in the industry?
Yeah, I'd say hackathons are pretty important because they provide like a portal for individuals who might be interested in learning more about the space and what is actually possible. You get immersed into all these different projects. You also get to meet a lot of people in the space who are interested in joining it just like you are. You can learn from some of the people. Some people can maybe even learn from you. And I think it also allows people who are already in the space to learn more about the cool, exciting projects out there and possible integrations that you can build between them.
Vincent, I always like to ask my guests after they've been working in Web3 for a while and have these really cool stories like you do about how you got involved, what they wish they would have known before they got started. So based on what you know now, if you could go back in time and impart one piece of knowledge or information to yourself before you got started, what would you say?
I would say to start really broadly, explore smart contracts, subgraph, front end, JavaScript, and tying it all together, like basically doing full stack. And then really honing in on one or two of those because there's just so much on each of those stacks and just so much going on in the space. It's quite hard to stay focused sometimes and not getting pulled into many different directions.
Well, let's turn our attention now to Superfluid. As you mentioned, you joined the team there and now you're full-time in Web3. What can you tell us about what Superfluid is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So Superfluid aims to formalize a new money primitive. The ultimate goal is to change the way that money works at a fundamental level. And we have a new definition, and it's called semantic money, which is a more formal definition, and it aims to capture what Superfluid's long-term vision is. In literal terms, it means adding more functionality to money. That is, instead of only A paying B, we enable the ability to, for example, to stream payments every second, or let's say distribute or stream money to a pool of people, paying at a future date, or streaming and or paying conditionally. And for those that are interested, our CTO, Meow, has written a formal paper on this, which goes pretty deep into this. It can be found at semantic.money. We'll put a link to the show notes of that. And in more concrete terms, I guess, what Superfluid is currently mainly known for is just enabling anyone to send money from one account to another every second, or block to be more technically accurate, with no recurring transactions. So it's just one transaction to set up the stream. Superfluid is able to facilitate money streaming by leveraging the new blocks that are constantly being created, and time being something that constantly moves forward. And in our case, it is being moved forward thanks to the miners and validators. And at a technical level, when you create a stream, how it works is that we save a few key pieces of information: the token you want to stream, the flow rate per second, and the time the stream that was created, as well as the recipient. So as the time progresses, your balance will decrease or increase based on if you are the sender or receiver, respectively. And this is done via adhering to the ERC20 standard. For those who know, the balance of function is changed to allow this to happen. And this means that you have instant liquidity to withdraw once a single second block has occurred when the money is streamed into your account, and even the ability to redirect the stream on the exact same block.
Most of my listeners will probably be familiar with this idea of a vesting contract. These things exist both in crypto and outside of crypto. And at a general level, these are situations where you're promised a certain sum of something, And then over a period of time, it vests, meaning, if you have a contract for 100,000 in 10 years, every year you'll get 10,000 of that as it vests yearly. Am I thinking correctly that Superfluid is somewhat like the facilitator of vesting contracts, or is it deeper than that?
I would say that it's different. Vesting requires an upfront capital lockup, but Superfluid does not.
I'd be curious to know then how Superfluid is different from competitors.
Right. So I'd say at a very fundamental level, there are no true competitors. We do often get compared to protocols which facilitate, streaming payments or vesting. But there are a few main differences I would like to point out. So first, there's greater capital efficiency. So there's no full upfront capital lockup, which means you don't have to lock up the 100,000 in order to stream over 10 years. You can lock up a smaller amount. So the amount you have to lock up is 4 hours of the per second flow rate that you plan on streaming. So whatever that 100,000 divided by 10 years, whatever that amount times 4 hours at a per second level. Secondly, programmability. So that's the ability to code against the protocol via something called Super App, a particular type of smart contract that the protocol recognizes. This allows you to write custom hook logic when a stream is created, updated, and deleted to a Super App. And finally, and arguably the most powerful distinction, is composability. Superfluid streams are composable. So that is in the same block that you receive a stream, you can immediately redirect that. And you can think of a simple use case as, for example, receiving a salary in a stream and DCAing into Bitcoin or Ethereum immediately. And this generalized streaming protocol like Superfluid allows us to build many things. For example, we recently came out with a vesting feature, and you can check out a bunch of posts on our Twitter and stuff about that.
Well, Vincent, I know I've already sort of asked this and you described this earlier, but just double clicking on it, can you describe your role at Superfluid and some of the things you're working on?
Sure. So I started out working on revamping our SDK. This is for JavaScript developers, as we wanted to broaden the reach of developers that would be able to build on Superfluid as much as possible. For example, in hackathons and other things, we actually have something called the Superfluid Wave Pool. In parallel, I also worked on revamping our subgraph. So that involved creating some new entities, writing out a custom integration test suite, and a CI workflow which deploys the subgraph. This is so we have a record of deployments on GitHub. And I would say that I'm basically the owner of the SDK core, the subgraph, and I'm working fairly heavily on implementing new features at the protocol level with our smart contracts.
I have a lot of questions I want to ask you about subgraphs and using the graph. Before we get there, who would you describe are the target users of Superfluid?
I would say that the primary target users for Superfluid is currently DAOs who may want to pay their contributors in streams, DAOs who may want to vest their tokens with, as we just came out with a vesting feature. So I guess those are the two primary target users.
If listeners want to learn more about Superfluid, what's the best way for them to dig in and see what's going on over there?
So for up-to-date alpha leaks, you can follow us on Twitter at superfluid_HQ and join our community on Discord. For developers, I highly recommend you subscribe and listen to our great podcast, Devs Do Something. If you want developer gems, you can listen to it on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. It's hosted by Sam, our DevX lead. You can also go to docs.superfluid.finance if you're interested in building on top of Superfluid. And you can go to superfluid.finance if you're interested in integration or partnering or anything like that. And lastly, I would say you can check out our amazing dashboard or app at app.superfluid.finance to try out money streaming yourself, or console.superfluid.finance if you want to see our custom built quote-unquote Superfluid Etherscan. Hi, this is Vincent with Superfluid. If my conversation with the GRT IQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTIQ podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Well, I'll put links to all that information in the show notes for any listeners that want to learn more. Before we turn our attention to the graph and subgraphs, I want to ask you this final question about how do you envision Superfluid impacting the world and the impact it can have on crypto and Web3?
The possibility of changing the way that money works at a fundamental level. Payments and the movement of money currently happens discreetly. And this is the way we've been doing it basically forever. And we've been doing it like this because of the limitations imposed by technology. But our technology has already upgraded and money has yet to catch up. And I believe we're pioneering Money 2.0.
Well, now let's talk about the graph. And you've said subgraphs many times, so I know that's part of the work that you're doing, and I want to ask questions about that. But before we do you recall when you first became aware of the graph?
Yeah, I definitely do. I first became aware of the graph very early on when I was diving into Web3. So when you first write your first smart contracts, you want to like hook it up to the front end and client and kind of play with it. And that way, at least I wanted to. And there's two main parts of doing this. So mutating state, which means just interacting with the smart contract and signing transactions and broadcasting them with something like MetaMask, and then also reading the state of the blockchain. And so while reading the state is pretty straightforward for simple data, when it comes to any data which requires history or the full state of your smart contract, this problem is not as trivial anymore. And it requires either you indexing the blockchain yourself, which is what the graph does, or running your own nodes, or paying a node provider for an endpoint to query the past events and rebuilding the data you want each time on the client side, or caching that somewhere in a database.
So why don't developers like yourself do that then? Why don't you just index and query the blockchain yourself?
So I would say that we can index the blockchain. This requires an archive node usually, but why spend developer resources reinventing the wheel when you can leverage, the amazing solution the graph have built, right? So instead of projects focusing on, figuring out how to index the blockchain, put this into storage somewhere, the projects can instead focus heavily on bringing about the vision of their projects instead of working on a problem already solved by someone else and also solved better. It's like comparative advantage, right?
Vincent, could you take a moment and describe the ways in which the graph, smart contracts, and subgraphs interact?
Yeah, so the graph has something called an indexer. So this is something which essentially just crawls the blockchain and looks at events emitted from a smart contract. And you can write some code to tell it how to create these data structures or objects that are called entities, which are based on the data logged from your smart contracts. So it then packages this into a GraphQL API endpoint, which consumers can use to query blockchain data in a far more intuitive and pleasant way.
Do you have any examples that you could share that would make that maybe more tangible for listeners?
So imagine you have a zookeeper and they have to continuously walk through a zoo with a notebook to check up on specific areas of the zoo and specific events to look out for and to write down notes. So depending on A, the area of the zoo, this would be the smart contract. B, the specific event. This is just the event that gets logged by your smart contract. And C, how the event is unfolding. So this is the particular properties of that event. The zookeeper has to record down the notes in a specific way. And these are the entities that get saved into the notebook. So this may mean like writing down the event as a new entry, exactly as it happened, or it may involve more complex instructions such as summing, multiplying, etc. And it may even involve something like updating an existing entry in a specific way in the notebook. You can then, whenever you want, ask the zookeeper for specific information, and they will respond based on what you've asked for.
I love it, Vincent. You've introduced a new analogy for ways that listeners can better understand the graph. And I want to ask this question about subgraphs such that they've become the industry standard for devs like you building in this space. And I'm wondering if you think that's true. Is the verdict in that subgraphs are the industry standard by which devs should query blockchain data?
Yeah, I would say it is. Unless you want to rebuild everything yourself and you have a very specific reason to do that, then you can do that. But otherwise, if you don't, and you want to, as quickly and effectively as possible, provide a consumable API which can manage the data from your smart contracts, then I would say that the graph is the way to go.
So how does Superfluid use the graph?
Yeah, so we rely on the graph quite a bit for all of our user-facing products. So it's quite an important piece of our stack. We utilize it in our dashboard. This is the site where you can view your ongoing streams, create, update, and delete your streams. We also use it in our console, which can be considered something like Etherscan, but just for Superfluid, where you can query information about streams and instant distribution agreements. And it's also part of our SDK. So leveraging the graph, we store, I guess, 3 types of entities: events, higher order entities, and aggregate entities. And this is going into a bit more of like how we architect our entities and in the subgraph. So it's a bit technical, but not too technical. Event entities are basically just one-to-one mapping of events emitted from the smart contracts. These are transient entities. Once they get emitted, they don't get changed ever for the most part. Then we have something called higher order entities, and these capture state for multiple events over time and are less transient than event entities. For example, we have a stream entity. Lastly, we have aggregate entities, and this captures state over time and are permanent, for example. We have something called a token statistic entity, for example, which captures token-specific stream data over its lifetime, such as current total active streams, the total outflow rate. So using something like the graph allows you to create this type of data in a fairly straightforward way. Whereas if you want to do this by yourself, you would have to basically collect history from the very first time you deployed a specific smart contract you want data for, and then building the data up from there.
When you were talking about the things you wish you knew before you got started in the industry, you talked about better understanding of the full stack. And for listeners that have been tuning into the podcast since the beginning, they know I've asked a lot of questions about the Web2 stack and the Web3 stack. In terms of the Web3 stack, how important is something like the graph?
I personally think that the graph is very important for Web3 because it really improves both the developer experience and user experience significantly. And this is really important for adoption, right? And I really think that it enables protocols to bootstrap in a far more effective way. It's what I like to call the good type of leverage, not the 100x on an exchange type.
Well, you bring up adoption there. As you look at important milestones that you're watching for, as we measure the adoption of crypto and Web3 throughout the world, what are some things that you're watching for?
It's really hard to say, but once we have use cases, protocols, dApps, where you aren't even aware that you're using crypto underneath the hood, and the experience is seamless, and there's more value add than existing Web2 services. If the companies or protocol is trying to replace something in Web2, then greater adoption will definitely follow in an exponential manner.
Well, Vincent, now I'm going to ask you the GRT IQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week. And I do it to help listeners. I want them to learn new things or try something different, and in some cases, achieve more in their own lives. So are you ready for the GRT IQ 10?
Yep.
The GRT IQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or articles had the most impact on your life?
I would say The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. It's like most self-help books, it's quite obvious, but it's laid out in a way that's easy to read and is kind of a reminder. I'd say that it definitely sparked my interest in self-help, as well as reading. And the year that I read that book, I read the most books I think I ever had read up to that point in my life. It's pretty amazing how fun reading is actually when it's not forced on.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I would say Rick and Morty is fun to watch.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
I didn't know albums were still a thing. No, just kidding. But probably something like Minutes to Midnight by Linkin Park, because that was the last album I think I bought. I honestly don't know any albums nowadays, so I can't recommend anything more recent.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
I can't think of any one individual, but over the course of a lot of different advice, I would say just to be curious, think critically, and execute ruthlessly.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I think some people might already know this, but it's just a good reminder to understand that time is the most valuable asset, and your health, of course.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
I'd say two things: staying physically active and meditating to stay present. The idea is fairly simple, but the actual process and execution is hard.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what's the one characteristic or habit that you think best explains how people find success in life?
I think those people who are highly curious and also highly obsessive and have a high sensitivity to pain points that people are suffering and are able to quickly develop and execute solutions on those often are successful.
And then the final three questions, Vincent, are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
The ability to work on bleeding edge technology and being pioneers in shaping the future of a more open financial system. The internet has basically been the largest equalizer, which has democratized most information out there, and in my opinion has improved social mobility quite dramatically for everyone.
And how about this one? If you're on Twitter, then you should be following.
I'm going to give kind of a meta answer. So it really depends on your personal short and long-term goals and what you're interested in. I think providing a framework for filtering signal from noise or on deciding who to follow is more useful than specific accounts to follow. So following accounts of people who are honest, provide value in an effective way, have more experience than you may be, more knowledge, and someone that provides actionable information is usually a good benchmark.
And lastly, complete this sentence. I'm happiest when?
I'm using some newly acquired or learned knowledge, or maybe previously acquired, or maybe combining something previously acquired and newly acquired to solve a problem and add value in some way.
The GRT IQ 10.
And I show you how deep the
Podcast.
Vincent, thank you so much for joining me. You've been gracious with your time and providing a lot of interesting insights, not only about your own story, but about Superfluid, as well as the ways in which Superfluid relies upon the graph and uses subgraphs. I think listeners will find your new analogy for the zookeeper and subgraphs super helpful. If people want to learn more about you and stay in touch with the things you're working on, what's the best way to connect?
Yeah, I have a Twitter. It's 0xDaVinci. You can feel free to follow me there. I don't currently have many posts, but I plan on writing and posting a lot more this year. So follow me there.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRT IQ
Podcast. Roger that.